Today's daf we're going to be learning is Menachot Daf Tetzayin. Today's daf is sponsored by Penina Hirsch in loving memory of her aunt and uncle Sarah Bat Chaim and Moshe Chaim Rosenfeld Weiss. Moshe was the only Holocaust survivor in his family, today, and so it's a memory of all of his relatives also lost in the Holocaust. Today is dedicated in honor of the return of Ron Gvili's body after 843 days in captivity. Definitely a day for celebration. Maybe still we're not in the simplest situation, but it is a very special day in after the last number of difficult years. So something definitely to celebrate. Okay, we're going to get started with the Mishnah. Pigul kometz v'lo b'levona. Our topic today is mefaglin b'chatzi matir. We keep making mention of it, and here we're going to finally see it inside in our Mishnah, which we quoted before. But this idea about if you have two actions that permit something, okay, in general, and we're going to talk about this a little bit more later in today's daf, but in general, pigul machshava is an issue, although we're going to see there's kind of two tracks about how something can become pigul. But one is when you have the pigul thought during the action that's called the matir, the item that's going to permit something else. So generally, okay, with a korban, it's the zrikat dam, it's the blood that you sprinkle on the altar, which permits either the food to be eaten, and therefore your machshava pigul is about the food that you're going to eat beyond the given time, or the parts you're going to burn on the altar. So all that is permitted by the zrika. If you haven't done the blood, then you can't do those stages. That's called the matir. Okay, with the mincha, which is really our topic, what's the matir? Well, that's where it becomes tricky. There's two things that have to happen in most menachot, which is the burning of the kometz, which is that part you took out of the mincha offering, and the burning of the frankincense. So there's two matirim here. So the question is, what if the pigul thought was only in one of them and not the other? So there's a machlok at Rabbi Meir and the rabbis, and that's what we're going to see. We're going to see it in the mincha case. We're going to see it in the two kvasim with the shtei lechem, and we're going to see it with the lechem apanim. The cases we keep going back to over and over. Pigul kometz v'lo b'levona v'lo b'kometz. So what if you had a pigul machshava? You thought you were going to eat it after the given time. When, right here, what are we talking about eating? The shirayim. Both these things permit the remainder to be eaten by the kohanim. So if you had a machshava pigul in the kometz, but not when you did the burning of the levona. In other words, when we say b'kometz, we mean when you're burning the kometz, but not when you're burning the levona, or b'levona v'lo b'kometz, or you did the pigul thought when you were burning the frankincense, but not when you did the burning the kometz. Rabbi Meir omer pigul v'chayvim alav karet. He thinks, so what if it's only half a matir? It's a matir, okay? It's not the only matir, but it's a matir, and it's pigul. Chachamim orim ein bo karet ad shifagel b'chol matir. The rabbis say, and we talked about this language yesterday, there isn't karet, meaning, well, you don't get karet unless you were mafaga the whole matir. Now, what does this mean? Well, it means we're going to disqualify it anyway, and we said because of gzera, right? We saw that, that was maybe 2 days ago. It's a gzera that we're going to say this is disqualified, but it's not really pigul, and that's why there's no karet. Remember, when do you get karet? If you ate the remainder, you wouldn't get karet because you have to have pigul for the whole matir. And you only did it for half the matir when you burnt the kometz or when you burnt the levona, but not in the other one. Umodim chachamim leRabbi Meir. This is where we got a whole inference from this Mishnah because this line is really unnecessary. The rabbis agree with Rabbi Meir, though, and the two menachot that have no levona. Obviously, the rabbis agree because why? In pigul b'kometz, while you're burning the kometz, if you had a pigul thought, it's pigul v'chayvim alav karet. Why? Sh'a kometz hu matir. Because the kometz itself is the matir, right? The kometz, it's the only thing there is. There is no levona, so burning the kometz is the whole thing. Okay, which we said was kind of obvious, and then we suggested that perhaps the reason why this is here is to say that the reason why the rabbis say it's pasul ve'en bo karet, meaning they're strict in the previous case, even though it's not pigul, is so that you don't confuse it with a case like this. Okay, and it's a gzera on account of this case. That was a diuk, an inference we have from this bright. Okay, but not so important for our purposes right now. Now we're moving on to two other parallel cases. Shachatecha min hakvasim. It's very classic of the Mishnah to just bring a bunch of different, similar, expressing the exact same idea. Shachatecha min hakvasim lechol shtei chalot lemachal. If you slaughter one of the sheep in the two sheep offering, right, the two kivsei atzeret that you bring on Shavuot, that go together with the two alechem, and they basically permit the bread. So if you slaughtered one, in order, right, with the thought that you're going to permit the eating of 2 chalot tomorrow, or you burnt 2 of the bowls of frankincense that go with the lechem hapanim, which permit the lechem hapanim, but you did only one of them with a thought that you're going to eat all the lechem hapanim tomorrow. Rabbi Meir omer pigul v'chayavim alav karet, v'chachamim omer ein bo karet ad shepagel b'chol matir. Again, say machloket. Rabbi Meir says, okay, it's just a chatzi matir, who cares? It's still pigul. Rabbis say, no, not unless you have a pigul thought about the whole thing. Okay, another case, which we actually quoted previously in the context of a different discussion. If you slaughter one of the sheep with a thought to eat from that meat tomorrow. Now here we're going to say, hu pigul v'chavero kasher. Now, when it comes to both of the sheep together permit the shtei alechem. They're considered one unit, and then we have this machloket. If you have a thought, a pigul thought, is it going to mess up the bread? Is it going to right? Is the bread going to be pigul? But when you're talking about each sheep independently with its own meat, well, the relationship between each sheep to its own meat is independent, because the slaughtering of one sheep doesn't permit the meat of the other sheep, right? Or it doesn't have any effect on the meat of the other sheep. So when it comes to the meat, if your pigul thought was about eating the bread, they go together. If the thought is eating the meat of that sacrifice beyond its given time, so that sheep will be pigul, and the meat of it will be pigul, but the other sheep is not affected by this in any way. And there's no chatzi matir here. But a different halacha now, this is something we learned previously also, if you have a thought of, while you're slaughtering one of the sheep, that you're going to eat the meat of the other sheep tomorrow, that has no connection whatsoever, because, right, that's one matir is permitting another matir, right? That's 2 different animals. One has no effect on the other. Okay, so you can't have a pigul thought about a different animal. Okay, that for sure is fine. Okay, now that was the machloket Rabbi Meir and the rabbis. Now we're going to get into a machloket Rav and Shmuel about this machloket. So Amar Rav, Gemara starts off with this machloket. Rav says, machloket shenatan et kometz b'shtika ve'et halevona v'machshava. Okay, the first thing you have to understand, just so it doesn't say this inside, it doesn't matter the order that you burn the kometz and you burn the levona. We talked about that in a different sugya. It doesn't make a difference. You can burn it in any order. So the order here is important, not in terms of which one you did first, the burning of the kometz or the burning of the levona. Those can be interchangeable in this section. Just so you know, it could be the levona first, the kometz first, it doesn't matter. Okay? The point is, what was your thought when you did each? And we're going to have a case where you were silent and a case where you had a pigul thought. How do we view your silence? Okay, sometimes we say shtika koda'ah, right? Sometimes shtika koda'ah means, right, if I ask you something and you don't answer, right, we mean maybe you're guilty, okay? Like you're admitting because you're not even saying anything. Here it's not the same thing as that. It's just a question of how do we, like always, the shtika koda'ah is how do we understand your silence? What do we take it as an understanding of? Silence is something, okay? The fact that you're not saying anything means something. So what does it mean in this case? So it depends when you were silent. We're assuming if you had a pigul machshava in one and not the other, well, what do you have in the other? Now, we don't assume you had, now there could be that in one you had a thought, I'm going to eat this meat beyond this given time, or I'm going to eat the remainder of the mincha beyond this given time. And in the other, you could have a thought, I'm going to eat it today, okay? But we're saying, what if you were just silent in one of the thoughts? You just didn't say anything. So can we figure out what you meant? And is that called that you didn't have a pigul thought? So it depends on the order, Rav says. The machloket Rabbi Meir and the rabbis is particularly in this case, where natan et kometz b'shtika, again, this is you burnt the kometz, or whichever one you burnt first. It could be burning the levona as well. If you did that one first, though, the whole thing is, what did you do first? B'shtika. You didn't have any particular thought at all. Ve'et halevona b'machshava. And then the second action you did, which in this case, if you burnt the kometz first, then you burnt the levona second, with a pigul machshava. That's going to be a classic case of chatzi matir. Of course, by the way, he's going to say that if you had a pigul thought and a thought that was clearly not pigul, I'm going to eat it today, for sure, that would also be a machloket. But what he's getting at is, what if you were silent, and which one were you silent in? So, that case, machloket. Aval natan kometz v'machshava ve'et halevona b'shtika. But if you started off that the kometz was b'machshava, and then you, again, it doesn't have to be the kometz, but the first one you did with a machshava, pigul. You said, I'm going to burn this, whichever one it is, I'm going to burn this tomorrow. I'm going to burn it. You're burning it. I'm burning it in order to eat the remainder tomorrow, which is not allowed. And then you did the next one, let's say in this case the lavona, bishtika. You didn't have any thought when you did the second burning. So now comes Rav and says they don't argue in that case. Everybody agrees, divrei hakol pigul. Why? Shekol haoseh. By the way, we saw this in Tzvachim, so it might sound familiar. Might not, but it might. Shekol haoseh al dat rishonahu oseh. If you have a thought in the beginning, and then you're silent after, we assume that your second action follows your first thought. If you're just silent, how do we understand that? You're continuing what you thought originally. Now, if you have silence first, we don't assume the worst, right? Even though you had a pigul thought later, we assume, okay, the first one was done properly. But if you had a pigul thought and you messed up the korban, and then you continue to have you continue just doing the actions, we assume those actions would follow the original ones, unless you say otherwise. So if you don't say otherwise, we assume you just go with it. And then the rabbis are going to say, oh, that's the whole, you did pigul in the whole matir, because silence means whatever you started with is what you thought now, which means you now did pigul in the first and now pigul in the second by default. Okay. Shmuel amar adayin hu machlok. Shmuel disagrees and says, no. Shtika is not defined as, oh, I'm continuing my pigul thought. If you don't have a particular pigul thought, we're back to chatzi matir, is it pigul, is it not pigul, Rabbi Meir, the rabbis. Okay, so now we're going to deal with Rav, and we're going to bring up two difficulties on Rav from the Tosefta in Tzvachim. Okay, from different parts in the Tosefta. So I'm going to start off with Yativ Rava, v'ka'amar la lahashmata. So Rava was sitting teaching Rav's halacha. Comes Rav Acha bar Rav Huna, and comes and raises a difficulty on Rava, basically on Rav. Okay, but where Rava was quoting Rav is saying, Eitivei Rav Acha bar Rav Huna l'Rava. And he brings the Tosefta. In the Tosefta it says, B'ameh dvarei amurim. When do we say that you're going to have, okay, and remember this source because we're going to come back to it later. In what case is there pigul by just having a pigul thought? Bikmitza, b'matan kli, u'b'hiluch. Okay, in the first three actions, there is no parallel action in the levona. Okay, why? Kmitza, you take the kmitza out. Okay, there is no kmitza of the levona. The levona, you just take levona, you put it in the kli, you take it out of the kli, but it's not, there's no kmitza action. Matan kli, putting the kometz in the kli. Obviously, if you don't take the kometz in the levona, you have to put it in the vessel. And bihiluch, and taking it to the altar. Now, here we're going to get to later. What do you mean? Isn't there the action of taking the levona to the altar? So we'll come back to that. Right now, let's just assume all these are really only by the kmitza. Okay? And not by the levona. There's no parallel action, which means it's the whole action. So you do it, pigul. Aval balo lahaktara, but when he gets to the part of burning it, natana kometz b'shtika. Now here's going to go through the cases. If you did the kometz b'shtika, you were silent, and then you did the levona b'machshava. Okay, that's the case that even Rav agrees they argue about, because the first was silent. So that means you did it okay, and the second one you did pigul, that's for sure machloket, chatzi matir. But now it continues. It says, et kometz b'machshava ve'et levona b'shtika. Both that case and the case where you started off in machshava and then did the next one, b'shtika, with silence, Rabbi Meir omer pigul v'chayavim alav karet. V'chachamim orim ein bo karet ad shifagel b'chol matir. What do you see here? Machloket in both cases. That's not Rav. Rav said there's only machloket in case one, not in case two. So that's the difficulty on Rav. So again, Rabbi Meir says pigul chayavim karet. Chachamim say ein bo karet ad shifagel b'chol matir. You need to have pigul in the whole thing, and your silence doesn't count as anything, it sounds like. Right? It doesn't count as, oh, you continued your original thought. And now they're just pointing out which line of this longer Tosefta that we brought is important. Katani Mia, it says there, Natana kometz b'machshava. You started off with a pigul thought. Ve'et halivona b'shtika, and then you were silent for the second. Upligate, and you see they have a machloket. That goes against what Rav said. So they're going to try to resolve this in a particular way that's not really going to work. Ema, why don't we say, when it said, okay, remember, the problematic line is you put the kometz with a machshava, meaning machshava pigul, and then you did the levona without anything. Why don't you say, ukvar natana levona b'shtika mi'ikara? That what it means is you did the kometz with a machshava pigul, but you had already brought the levona in silence. Okay? And then we basically put the second one back to being the first one, and then we resolve the problem. Okay, there's two problems with this. Shtei tshuvot b'davar. tshuvot are answers, but sometimes they're lashiv means to retort. It's a retort. There are two retorts, two problems. Chada dahainu kamaita. Well, in case 1 and case 2 are identical. Okay, they're not completely identical. Let's just go through them. If you change case 2 to basically start with shtika and end with machshava, they're the same because they both start with shtika and with machshava. There is a difference. What's the difference? Well, the first one is the kometz, you were silent, and the levona you did with machshava. And this one is levona, you were silent, and the kometz you did with machshava. But since we already discussed that the order doesn't matter, which one you burn first and which one you burn second, so since the way we reread this is that both are talking about whether you did the kometz, whether you did whether you were burning the kometz or you were burning the levona, either which way your first one was silent and your second one was pigul, well, that's really one and the same thing. Ve'od, Hatanya, there's a braita where the same thing appears as the Tosefta, but with a minor difference. It says, achar kach, and after you did the levona, bishtika. Okay, so if you read that version of it, right, that braita, for sure you can't explain it that the levona came first, because it says, and after you do the levona. So basically, even if this Tosefta doesn't create a problem, the other one for sure does. And that's probably what it means anyway. Like that version, that braita really seems to indicate what this one means. So it's very hard to say that that's what it is. So now we're going to give a different answer. Tirgamar of Chanina b'shtei deot. We're going to explain there were two different people. If you're the Kohen who's doing both actions, and you do the first one with machshava pigul, and the second one you do without any sort of intent, we assume whatever you thought originally is continuing. But if somebody else came in and did the action, okay, well, someone else came in and did the action. So that means they're not going by your thought. They have their own thoughts entirely. It's two deot. It's two different people, two different minds. So you can't say if I started it with pigul and you came in and continued and did it silent, you did the next action as I burnt the kometz. You went and burnt the levona. So just because I did mine with pigul, who's to say you continued and did it with pigul? If you don't say anything about what your intent is, we assume you had the proper intent. We can't say you're continuing my train of thought. That doesn't make any sense. So we have to explain what we basically say is the Tosefta. When it says, if you did the pigul first and then shtika, it means someone else did the shtika after. And that's going to be a chatzi matir because only one of the ones were done problematically. And that resolves our issue. Okay, now we're going to bring another Tosefta. We're going to try to resolve it in the same way, and we're only going to be partially successful. So Tashma, Pamed Varim Amurim. Okay, what are we talking about here? You have to understand the context. You remember there's sprinklings of the blood that are done on the outer altar. That's usually in most korbanot. And then there's a few that are done inside the sanctuary, which are done, on Yom Kippur inside the Kodesh Kodashim, and then to the parochet, and then on the Mizbeach. Some are done just on the Mizbeach, some are done on the Mizbeach and the parochet, but not in the Kodesh Kodashim. Okay, there's the Parlin Davar Shel Tzibor, the Par Kohen Mashiach, all these different sacrifices that are done inside. Now there's a difference in terms of the obligation of the bloods in both places. The ones that are done on the outer altar, even though some of them, like the sin offering, you need to do 4 on all 4 corners. Some of them you need to do 2, but get it on all 4 sides, okay? Without getting into the details. But we learned that if you only did 1 on the outer altar, you fulfill your obligation. Now that is not true on the inner ones. The inner ones, you have to do them all. They're ma'akev. They're essential. The outer ones, do it better to do them all, but if you only did 1, it's pigul. So now let's go to our case. What's the relevance? Well, bamed varim amurim, that if you just did 1, now here we have to connect this with pigul. If I did 1 zrika on the outer altar, 1 placing of the blood, with a pigul thought, since theoretically, if I only did 1 zrika, I would actually be permitted to eat the meat, burn the parts on the altar, right? That's the end of the korban, even though it's not really, I'm supposed to do more. But if I only did that, I'd actually permit. So it's complete matir. So if I had a pigul thought only when I was doing 1 of the placings of the blood, that actually is pigul according to everyone, because that's the whole matir. But aval damim nitanim lamizbeach hapnimi kigon 43 shel Yom Kippurim. Okay, let's go through very fast. 43, 16 echad lamala sheva lamata times 2. Okay, that's 8. 1 up, 7 down. All with the dama par and then with the dama seir inside the Kodesh Kodashim, that's 16. You do the same 16 onto the parochet. Then you go, right, that's you walk out of the Kodesh Kodashim, you do them onto the parochet toward Kodesh Kodashim. Then, so that's 32. Then you do another 11. You do 4 on the Mizbeach, and then 7 you sprinkle onto the top of the mizbeach, 4 on each of the 4 corners, and then 7 on top. That gets you to 43. So now, and then by the way, from that point, at the first 2 parts, you do separate blood, par, and seir. When you get to the altar, and you want to put the 4 on the altar, and then the 7, you use a combination of the blood of the dam of the bull and of the goat, and therefore there's only 4 and 7. It's not times 2. Okay, so now that's just background. So the 43 of the Yom Kippurim and the 11 shel par kohen Mashiach, because there you do 7 on the parochet and 4 on the mizbeach, and the 11 shel par lim davar shel tzibor, same thing. Pigul. Okay, now we're going to get to sets. Now there's 3 sets. There's really 4 sets. Okay, well, there's different ways of. We're just going to stick with. We'll call it 3 because there's 1 in Kodesh Kodeshim, 1 toward the parochet, and 1 on the mizbeach. So pigul, bein barishona, whether it's in the first group, bein b'shniya, or the second group on the parochet, or the third group, which is on the mizbeach. Rabbi Meir omer pigul v'chayavim alav karet. Chachamim omrim ein bo karet ad shivagel b'chol matir. So what do you see here? Right, same situation. It's only part of a matir as opposed to the outer altar where 1 is enough to be yotze. Here, you can't get anything, right? Nothing's going to be permitted until you do everything. Okay, what's permitted here? Well, really, it's just permitted to burn. You're supposed to burn the animal outside. You don't even eat any part of it. But okay. But anyway, the point being that this is only a partial matir, each section. Okay. Now, what do you see here? Katani mia pigal bein barishona bein b'shniya bein b'shlishi pligi. Now, it doesn't say, let's say you started in Pigul Barishona, and then you didn't do any sort of thought. You were silent for the second and third. According to Rav, there's no machloket, because your second and third follow your first. So, and you can't say it's 2 different dayot here, because it's 1 Kohen who does everything. The Kohen Gadol does everything. So, we have a problem. Now, if you want to say it was 2 different people, well, we're going to now say this could partially work. It depends what you hold about a machloket about the avodah on Yom Kippurim. So, by the way, the 3 groups is only for the Yom Kippur. If it's the par lim davar shel tzibor or the par kohen Mashiach, there's only 2. It's 2 sets. But it would be the same. Bein barishona, bein b'shniya. It's still the same problem. Now, what's the problem? Well, hani chalaman damar, you could answer. And this is going to be one track to answer the question. With the other track, we're going to get stuck. You can answer that it was 2 different people if you hold. Okay, here's a pasuk about Yom Kippur, a very famous pasuk. Bizok yavo el Aharon el HaKodesh. With this, Aaron will come to the Kodesh Kodeshim. Bipar ben bakar lechataf ayalola. With the par. Okay, now, they're saying this word is kind of extra because you knew it's the par. So they say, what's this coming to teach you? Bipar afilu bidamo shel par. Even just bringing the blood. Meaning, even if you didn't slaughter the animal and you just brought the blood, you could do that. And what would be the case where you wouldn't slaughter the animal? The Kohen Gadol does all the avodot about this. Well, let's say the Kohen Gadol slaughters the animal, brings the blood inside the Kodesh Kodeshim, sprinkles the blood, and then comes out and drops dead. Or gets impure. And then we have to bring a replacement Kohen. So if you hold, the replacement Kohen can just bring the blood. In other words, he can just deal with the blood. He doesn't have to go starting from the beginning. He can pick up where the other one left off. Then you could have a case where 1 set was done by 1 Kohen, the second set was done by another, and the third set was done by another, and each one had their own separate thoughts, and that's why this isn't a difficulty on Rav. Okay, so that works. But if you go on track 2, Elalamanda Amar Bipar, everyone thinks there's a drasha on this word par. The question is what you do with it. The other one says Bipar v'lo b'damo par. You have to actually bring the par yourself, meaning you have to start from the beginning. So then you can't ever, the blood has to all be sprinkled by the same person. So you can't possibly answer Shtei De'ot to resolve our problem. So Ma'ika Lameimar. So Amar Rava, we're going to have 2 possible answers here. Amar Rava, Hacha b'mayaskinan, Kigon shepigel b'rishona v'shatak b'shniya u'pigel b'shlishit. You could have the same Kohen, but what did he do? He had a pigul machshav in the first. Then he was silent, which according to Rav, that would follow, right? That would also be pigul. And then he had a pigul machshav in the third. Now that he had a specific, now if you go with Rav, then all he needed to do, if he really wanted to be mefagel this korban and ruin it, was have a pigul machshava the first time and not the second or the third. So the fact that he had a pigul machshava in the first and then in the third, but not in the second, would be an indicator that his, again, this is all, how do we view your silence? Well, your silence could be viewed differently now that you actually had a pigul thought in the third. It's obvious then you didn't mean in your silence to continue the thought. Otherwise, why would you bother having a pigul thought in the third time? You already said it was pigul. Why say it again? So, Damrina, as we say here, if you're going to say everyone does based on their first thought, then why did he bother redoing it? Okay, and therefore, in this case, now, this is a little hard to say, and that's what we're going to question right now. Doesn't say he had a pigul thought, he was right, then he was silent, then he did pigul. It just says bein b'rishona, bein b'shniya, bein b'shlishi. Doesn't really seem to indicate this. Okay, that answer didn't work. Second attempt to answer. Now the person who asked the question now answers his own answer. Ela amar Rav Ashi. In other words, he was the one who raised the difficulty. Now he says, I have ubashlishi in parentheses. This sort of has to do with you view it as 4 or 3, but let's just leave that out of it. Let's just go with rishona and shniya, but not the third. So you had a pigul thought in 1 and 2 and not in 3. Tamrina isakadatach kolo seldat rishona ose mehadr piguli b'shniya lamali. Now you say, if it just continues, then why do you have to do pigul the second time? Okay, and then that would be okay. So now we're going to say, maybe the third he wasn't meant for pigul, because if he did, he would have done it a third time. And the fact that he doesn't, maybe his silence isn't interpreted as pigul. Turning out I'm a bet, but they don't like Rav Ashi's either, because ha bein katane. But it says whether the first, whether the second, whether the third, which makes it sound, Rashi says, okay, even Rav Ashi later had a problem with, didn't say shatat, but here they're saying it sounds like it was really only in one of them and not in 2 of them. And that makes it difficult according to what Rav Ashi said. And we end with kashya. So actually, this second source, this Tosefta, only works if you're of the school of thought that we could somehow say it's 2 different people, if you hold that the new Kohen can just come in and take over where the other one left off. But if you hold that one Kohen has to do everything, then you're not going to be able to explain it well at all, according to what Rav said. And we're going to have a difficulty on Rav. Okay, before we get back to our topic, we have 2 side issues we have to deal with, since we mentioned this Tosefta. So Amar Mar. So we're going to go back to a quote we had here. Rabbi Meir, pigul v'chayavim alav karet. Now, we're going to have a separate problem here with the Yom Kippur case. Okay, and this has to do with another criteria of pigul that we discussed in Svachim, but we'll review it again. It's a bit of a hard concept to get your head around, which is michti karet l'machayev ad shikarvu kol hamatirim. You're not going to be liable for pigul unless everything else was done the way it's supposed to be done. We talked about this when we had the lo lishma and the right or chutzlim kamo and pigul. Everything else has to be done properly. How do we know this? Here's the source for it. Yeratzeh, that's in the korban of pigul. If you eat it on the third day, pigul hu lo yeratzeh, or pigul, it won't be accepted. Okay, now Yeratzeh, what does it mean it will be accepted? Okay, it won't be accepted, but they say k'hartza'at kasher k'hartza'at pasul. The same way a kosher korban is accepted, meaning if you did everything the way it's supposed to be done, this korban will be called pigul as long as you did everything else the way it's supposed to be done. Okay, so mahartza'at kasher ad shikavu kol hamatirim. So what does it mean hartza'at kasher? You have to do everything that's supposed to be done in the korban properly. Af hartza'at pasul ad shikavu kol hamatirim, right? All the things that permit the korban to be permitted have to be done, other than your one pigul machshava that you had, and then the meat will be pigul if you eat it, and you'll get karet for it. Okay, what's the problem? Well, the problem here is, how could you have a case of pigul with Kohen Gadol if you're mefagel bein b'rishona, bein b'shniya, bein b'shlishi, in one of the sets of the blood? Because now, when you took that blood and you messed up inside in the Kodesh Kodashim, you also, besides that you were mefagel the korban, you ruined the blood. So now, kimade behechal, now when you go outside and do the second and the third sets, made is lahazot, mazeh, sprinkle, because Dalet and Zayin switch in Aramaic. When you sprinkle in the hechal, maya ba'alma hu dekamade. You're basically just sprinkling water. You're not really sprinkling blood. So in the end, you didn't really do the rest of the korban the way it's supposed to be done. Okay? Because here, this is different than a regular korban, where let's say you slaughtered it not the right way, and theoretically you could say also, well, when you sprinkle the blood, it was just water because you ruined the korban. But that's different, because that was in shchita and this is zrika. Your whole zrika could be viewed as a whole entity. Here we have the zrika is made up of 3 parts, and you ruin one part, so how could you say that we did the zrika the way it's supposed to be done? In the end, you didn't really, because you really did nothing after you messed it up with the first sprinkling. So, how can we view this? We're going to have 2 possible answers. Okay, what if you spill the blood in between, right? And then you have to bring a new animal. And then you spill the blood again, you bring a new animal. Each time you bring a new animal, for each set of blood, well, if you did that, then you could say the rest of it was done the right way, because they're not just pouring blood that's, ruined blood. They're pouring blood that's supposed to be poured, right? It's way to be poured because you slaughtered a new animal in between. Okay, so that would be a good case. Rav Amar, here by the way, they're talking about 4 because they really do view it as 4 sets. Inside, toward the parochet, right, inside the Kodesh Kodashim, toward the parochet, the 4 corners of the altar, and then the 7 sprinklings on top. So if each one was done, now you don't even need each one. You could say in between, let's say the one you messed up and the one that was good, right? You brought a new animal because let's say the blood spilled. Okay. Rava Amar, Filu Tema Parachav Seir Echad Lipigule Meratzi. Rava has a good answer. He says, you're right that theoretically you kind of ruined the blood already and you're just really sprinkling water. But since you did the actions of sprinkling the blood for the purposes of pigul, this is considered ritzui. It's considered like you did all the actions the way they're supposed to be done, even though in a halachic realm you really didn't do anything because you just sprinkled something that's like water because it's not really blood anymore because you ruined it. But you actually did the actions, and it's a whole concept that's weird anyway, that in order for it to be pigul, everything else has to be done properly, so it's done properly enough for it to be considered pigul. Okay, that's a different explanation. Now, that was one aside. Now we're going to get off on a shorter aside, which is 43, aren't there 47, not 43? So they say, Alo kashya hakamad amar marvin lekanot, v'hakamad amar e marvin. I said before, as if it was obvious, but now we're going to see there's a machloket about it. Okay, you do 16 inside, 8 of the par, 8 of the seer. You do 16 toward the parochet, 8 of the par, 8 of the seer. Okay, the bull and the goat. That's 16, 16, 32. But now there's a machloket what happens next. Some people say, and that's how I explained it before, that you mix the blood of both at this point, and then you do the 4 and the 7, that's another 11, that gets you to 43. Some people think that first you do the 4 corners of the altar of the bull, then of the goat. That adds another 4, and that's how we get to 47. And then you mix the bloods and do the 7 on top of the altar. And okay, so that's what marvin the kanot and lo marvin, e marvin the kanot. Do you mix it before you put it on the 4 corners or not? The hatan yarbe vishmona, but wait, there's another source that says 48. Lo kasha, hakaman damar shilayim makvin, hakaman damar shilayim lo makvin. There's machloket about the remainder of the blood. When you're done with everything inside the heichal, you take whatever's left of the blood that's still in your bowl, and then you take it outside into the courtyard, and you pour it on the base of the altar. Now, generally, the remainder is the remainder, and it's not an essential part of the korban. But you might remember, we've seen this a bunch of times, there's a machloket about specifically in the ones that are done inside, in the inner altar, like the ones we're talking about, including the Yom Kippur one, are the shirayim essential? Some people think the shirayim in those cases are essential. So if you say they're essential, then you count it in the count of the 47, which now becomes 48, because it's one pouring of all the remainder of the blood. Now we get back to our topic of chatzi matir. That was all an aside because, again, what did we do so far today? Just to clearly structure the daf. We started with this machloket Rabbi Meir and the rabbis. Then we had a machloket about mefaglin v'chatzi matir or not. Is it pigul if you only do it in part of the action? From there we got to Rav and Shmuel, this machloket. Is the machloket even in a case where one was done, right, and the other one was done with shtika? Or according to Rav, if it was done first, pigul, then silenced, your silence is defined as continuing the pigul, and that's considered as if you did it in the whole matir. So he limits the machloket. We had 2 difficulties on Rav. We resolved the first. We only partially resolved the second, depending on what you think about this par, the drasha on the par, and what you could do on Yom Kippur. And from there, we got a little bit off on the side about some questions that came up from there. Now we're back to chatzi matir. And now we get back to something I mentioned in the beginning and I said we're going to deal with later, which is the action of holacha. Now, clearly, if you take the kometz and you put in the kli, those are clearly the entire action. But what about walking, bringing the kometz to the altar? That's only half an action because you also have to bring the lavona to the altar. So they asked the following question: Pigel b'holacha mahu. Now, we did see the source where it put it on the side with the first 3. Okay, so we're going to have a difficulty with that in a minute. But if you're mefagel when you're walking the kometz to the altar, mahu, what's the halacha? Amar Rabbi Yochanan, holacha kekmitza. It's just like taking the kometz out, which you do it just for the, right? It's just for the kmitza. Basically, we don't see this as a chatzi matir. Okay? It's a complete action, even though you really do have to bring the levona. So we're going to have to deal with Rabbi Yochanan. It's a little bit strange, even though it fits perfectly with the source we saw before that distinguished between the first three and the burning of the kmitza. It never said the holacha is a chatzi matir. But logic would state that it is a chatzi matir. And that's what Rish Lakish says. Rish Lakish amar holacha kehaktara. It's just like the burning. Because it's just like the burning, it's a chatzi matir. And unless you had a pigul machshava with the levona, when you're walking the levona, it's not going to be pigul. Or at least according to the rabbis. Again, Rabbi Meir thinks anyway, chatzi matir doesn't matter. But according to the rabbis. So bishlam ala Rish Lakish. Rish Lakish makes a lot more sense. Ikanami holacha de levona. Because you still have to walk the levona. Ela Rabbi Yochanan my time. But what's Rabbi Yochanan's reason? Amar Rava, kasava Rabbi Yochanan. This is a very hard line to understand. Kol avodah she'ena materet, avodah chashuva hi lefagel aleha b'fnei atzma. Okay, he brings up something new, and I kind of referenced this in the beginning of Kaf. There's certain things that you're going to have pigul because they're a matir, like the sprinkling of the blood, like the burning of the incense. They're matirs. A matir, then we get into the whole world of chatzi matir. What if it's only partially a permitter, right? It's something that permits something else. Then there's other things like taking the kometz, okay, and a sacrifice, slaughtering, where we said this pigul, collecting the blood, walking it to the altar. Those are not permitters, okay? Even though theoretically the slaughtering kind of permits the blood to be sprinkled, but it's not really permitting anything, okay? It's not really a permitter. So they're on a different track, and that track doesn't have chatzi matir or anything, okay? That's what we're basically saying. What's their track? Well, they're an avodah chashuvahi. They're an important, essential part of the korban, right? That's what we talked about in Zvachim Lot. Those 4 actions are super important. Now, Zrika has this additional thing that it's a matir. Likewise, the burning of the kometz and the burning of the bezichei levonah. They're all matirs. And then they enter the world of matir. Anything that's not a matir, like taking the kometz, like putting it in the kli, like carrying it to the altar, those aren't matirs. They don't actually permit anything. They're just in a different world. What's that called? Avodah chashuva. Once it's in the avodah chashuva world, they're lefagel aleha b'fnei atzma. They in and of themselves are a significant action, that even if there's a parallel action that has to be done also, since it's not in the world of matir, we don't view it that way as one unit. And therefore, you're mefagel in the holacha, even though there's also levona that has to be done, we don't view it that way because it's a different track. Okay, that's what he says. So now we're going to have 2 difficulties on Rabbi Yochanan and then 1 difficulty back on Rish Lakish. Amar le'abai, harei shchita techa min hakvasim. Okay, shchita, we also said, is not a matir. Avodah she'ena matirata. Hu pligi. When you slaughter one of those sheep, well, in a sense, right, it's now slaughtering, we kept talking about the slaughtering permits the bread. It doesn't really. It's the sprinkling of the blood of the meat that permits the blood, the eating of the bread. But the slaughtering of the animal is not actually a matir. Why is it pigul? Because it's an avodah chashuva. But what do we see? We put it in the category of a matir, right? We call it, oh, you only did one sheep, not the other. It was in our Mishnah, right? Upligi, how do we know? It's not. It says in our Mishnah. Now, just going to review our Mishnah. Okay, we don't need the bezichim one because that's definitely a matir. But the shchita is not a matir. When I slaughter that animal, I can't immediately eat the bread. So it didn't do anything, right? Until I do the sprinkling of the blood. So Rabbi Meir omer pigul v'chayvim alav karev v'chachamim omer bo karev ad shavega b'chol matir. And according to what you just said, it's an avodah chashuva. It's avodah chashuva. It should be a problem in and of itself. One slaughtering of one sheep should already make it pigul. So Amrle, so now they're going to basically make it like a matir, even though it's not really. They're going to say, Misavar lechem b'tanur kadosh. What makes the bread sanctified? Now you might think, when does the bread become sanctified? You would think when you put it in the oven, because the oven is a klei sharet. The ovens in the temple were sanctified vessels. But no, it's not. Shchitat fasim mekad shala. When you slaughter that sheep, it makes the bread sanctified. So it does more than just slaughtering, which gets you ready for sprinkling the blood. It does more than that. It has effects on the bread because the bread at that moment became sanctified. Therefore, we're going to view it, Habala Kadesh Kebala Tir Dami. It's like a matir. And then it goes into the matir track. So it's something, as soon as something is mekadesh, something else goes on when that action happens. Opposed to holacha. Holacha is just a prerequisite, right? Which is important. You need it. If you don't bring it to the altar, you can't burn it on the altar. But it's just a prerequisite. This is much more so. So then it goes into the matir category, and then, you need both matirim, because it actually didn't sanctify the bread until you slaughter both sheep. Okay, now we're going to try to do something similar here, but now we're leaving the world of pigul, we're going into something else. Matir Rav Shimi bar Ashi. Acherim omrim. Okay, acherim is Rabbi Meir, so that's why this is important. Higdim mulim la'arelim kasher. This is slaughtering your korban pesach with the thought that you're slaughtering it for people who can't eat your sacrifice, like non-circumcised people who can't eat a korban pesach. Now, you also, when you slaughter, there's two actions. There's two matirim, so to speak, or two things. There's the two simanim. You slaughter the trachea and the esophagus. What if you slaughtered one with a thought for mulim, for circumcised people, and then your second one you slaughtered with a thought, I'm doing this for uncircumcised people, arelim. Well, that's kasher. Why? Because we view your second one is adding to the first. So your second one is, you said, also uncircumcised people. Now, if you do it for people who can and can't eat, you've included in the set also people who can eat, it's fine. So you did the first siman for circumcised and your second one for uncircumcised. What you really meant was also circumcised and uncircumcised, so that's fine. But here's the case that's important for us. Higdim arelim lemulim pasul. If your first siman was for non-circumcised and your second one was for circumcised, it's a problem. Because in your first siman, half of your shechita was done for people who it's not valid for. And Rabbi Meir says this, but we learn that there's a machloket here in this case. So that seems to break our mold, because we said shechita is not a matir. And this isn't sanctifying anything. There's no breads to be sanctified here that we could have used in the other one. So he said, what do you mean? Of course something gets sanctified here. What gets sanctified? The blood. When you slaughter, that sanctifies the blood, so it becomes like a matir. What, you think the blood inside the animal is sanctified? It's the knife that makes it sanctified. And one who sanctifies is basically like matiring. And you only did it in half, and therefore this is like the mefaglim b'chatzi matir. Okay, difficulty on Rish Lakish. Tashma b'ameh dvarim amurim. Now we're going to go back, and we know the difficulty on Rish Lakish because I mentioned it, which is that braita we saw earlier. B'kmitza b'matan kli u'b'hiluch. Right? When do we have this problem? We have it in, right, kmitza, when you put in the kli, and when you do the hiluch. But, right, when you get to the haktara, then already we get into the world of chatzi matir. Now, Rish Lakish said holich is also chatzi matir, because you have to be molich le'lavona also. It's not going to be, right, according to rabbis, it won't be, but that's not what it says here, right? My lav hiluch daktara, don't we mean walking to go burn it, which you also have to do that with the lavona. So they say, no, look, hiluch de matan kli. Oh, wait, there's two hiluchs. One is bringing the kli, so that bringing the kometz over to the kli, to put it in the kli. When you take the kometza out of the bowl, you walk it over to put it in the vessel. That's the holacha. There's no parallel to lavona. Okay, that sounds nice, but what's the problem? Well, number one, ihachi b'matan kli ubihiluch. Okay, it says you do the kometz, matan kli, and walking it. Well, the order is wrong according to what you just said. You're saying it's the hiluch that's only by the kometz, which should then be before you put it in the kli, because you're walking the kometz over to the vessel. Behiluch b'matan kli mevayle. It should have said hiluch then matan kli. Okay, halo kasha t'nei hachi. They say that's easy. Just switch the order. We can say the braita had that mess up, no problem. But there's still another problem. It says balo lahaktara, but when you get to the burning of it, that's when it's going to be a chatzi matir issue. So they said balo lalacha mevayle. It should have said as soon as you get to the walking of it and then the burning of it, we're going to have a problem of chatzi matir. So halo kasha, that's not a problem. Kevanda holacha sorech haktara yikare lehaktara. Since holacha is just holacha leads to haktara, they said haktara, they really meant holacha also. They say, okay, that sounds good, but ela natan la'et hakometz b'shtika holich mebayle. When it says, if you did this b'machshava and you did the kometz, natan et hakometz b'shtika, it should have said holich v'natan et hakometz, because that really is a problem even when you did it already b'holich b'shtika. So kasha, so that really is a problem. And then it's really hard to understand Rish Lakish according to that Tosefta that we saw. Okay, now we go to the last sugya for today. Hiktir shum shum le'echol shum shum. What if shum shum is sesame seeds, and we're not talking about sesame seeds, we're talking about the size of sesame seeds. You burn a teeny bit to eat a teeny bit. Okay, that for sure isn't pigul. But what if you continually burn a teeny bit of the kometz, keep burning a teeny bit of the kometz, every time you think I'm going to eat the first little bit out of its time. Then you burn another bit, I'm going to eat the next little bit. Burn the other next little bit until you finally do it to the whole thing. And you've basically burnt the whole thing with a thought to be mefagel the whole thing. But you did it in teeny little bits and pieces. So the question is it pigul or not? Right? Achakala kometz kula, until you completely burnt the whole kometz with machsheva pigul all along the way. But each one in teeny little amounts that aren't really a requisite amount. So Rav Chisda, Rav Meir, Rav Sheshet, the three of them, we're going to have a range of opinions. Chadam are pigul, Chadam are pasul, Chadam are kasher. One says it's pigul, one says it's disqualified, meaning in between. One says it's completely fine. So at first they think that this breaks down into Rabbi Meir Chachamim, and we're going to see Rabbi that we also learned already in the past. Lema mandam are pigul ke Rabbi Meir, because it's chatzi matir, because each time you did it, it was just a part of it, and mefaglim b'chatzi matir. And then pasul ke Rabbanan. Uman damar kasher ke Rebbe. The one who says it's kasher is Rebbe. What's Rebbe? Rebbe said, if you do one keves with a thought of half a zayit and one keves with a thought of the other half a zayit of bread, they don't combine because you don't have enough of a shear in anything. So, and it's totally kasher. So that we think is Rebbe. But they say, no. Mimai. Dilma al kan lo kama Rebbe hatam ela dechashe b'shiuro. When Rabbi Meir said you're chatzi matir is because you did a half an action with a thought you were going to eat a whole kazayit though. Here you didn't even have a thought you were going to eat a whole kazayit. You have a thought each time you're going to eat a teeny bit. So that doesn't count. You didn't have a machshava about a shear of eating. Maybe not. Rabbanan said it was an issue because you only thought about it when you did the burning of the kometz and not the levona at all. But here in the end, right? In the end, you had a pigul machshava for the entire heter process, matir process. You just did it in teeny little parts. Hachanami to pigul. Maybe he would say it is pigul. And akan lo kama Rebbe hatam elatilo hadramal yameota avoda. In the end, what happened there? How did you get to a full shear? Well, one was when you slaughtered one sheep and you got to half a shear, and then you slaughtered the second sheep and got to the other half shear. And in the end, the eating was two different breads, and the slaughtering was two different animals. Here, in the end, it's all the same thing. You just add it up, and it could keep going, and maybe you would actually have pigul here. Chanami de pagil. So, right, aval hacha de hadramal me'ota avoda. You did the same avoda. It was the whole time the kometz, right? The burning of the kometz. Maybe it would be pasul. Okay, so Elamanda Amar. So now we're going back to these three rabbis, not Rabbi Meir, and the rabbis, but these three rabbis we saw before. Okay, who all argue about this. Mandamar Pigul said everyone, all Rabbi Meir, the rabbis, they would all agree with me about my opinion. And Mandamar Pasul Divrei Akol, they would all agree with me. And the one who said Kasher Divrei Akol. So now we have to explain what the machloket, and with that we'll finish. Mandamar Pigul Divrei Akol Kasaval Derech Achila B'kach v'Derech Haktara B'kach. The whole question is going to be, is it normal to burn bits and pieces? And is it normal to eat bits and pieces? So the first one says it's normal to burn bits and pieces and normal to eat bits and pieces, and therefore, as long as in the end you had a pigul machshava about the whole thing, but you did it in teeny little increments, it's all pigul, because that's normal burning, normal eating. Now, each of the other opinions is going to say either it's normal burning, not normal eating, or normal eating, not normal burning. So mandamar pasul divrei akol kasaval derech achila b'kach. It is normal to eat in little bits and pieces, but ein derech haktara b'kach. But it's not normal to burn it that way. So havya like a mincha shelo ktara. It's like a mincha that wasn't fully properly burned, but your pigul machshava was about eating a whole shear because you ate it in parts. But that's normal to eat it. And as you talked about, I'm going to eat it in parts. It's normal to do that. So it's a pigul machshava, but it's not really pigul because you're missing the haktara, proper haktara. So we'll say it's this in between, and we'll disqualify. It's a normal way to burn things like this, but it's not a normal way to eat them. Now, what's pigul if you don't have a thought about eating it? The whole problem with pigul is you thought I'm going to eat it or burn it on the altar. In this case, it's eating though. And your method of eating was not a normal method of eating. So there's no pigul at all, and therefore it's kasher. Because without a machshava about eating, there's just no pigul. Okay. So our three sections today, we started with pigul, this chatzi matir issue, machlok of Rabbi Meir and the rabbis. Rav and Shmuel with their machloket about what case do they exactly disagree about. We had some issues with Rav, left some actually a little unanswered questions. From there, we got a little off on a tangent into some of the things about Yom Kippur service. And then we got back to section 2 was pigul b'holacha, also a chatzi matir thing, or is it chatzi matir, is it not, is it on a different track, holacha, right? We had the two opinions of Rabbi Yochanan and Rish Lakish. We asked two difficulties on Rabbi Yochanan, one on Rish Lakish. Some ended with, right, the one on Rish Lakish ended with a difficulty. And then we ended with this case of tarav little bits, to eat little bits, but in the end you get the whole thing. How do we view that? We ended up with the 3 opinions. We thought maybe they connected with previous machlokot. In the end we say this is a completely different machlokot about how you view eating and burning of little bits. Is that normal? Is it not normal? Just good, interesting question. With that, we finished for today. Wishing everyone a good day.